Alright, so in case it wasn't obvious from the title of this video, I'm done with TYT. Now, before we get into like everything about this isn't about all of the hosts. There are actually a ton of people at TYT that I think are genuinely cool people. We're mostly going to be focusing on their transphobia. Incredibly transphobic. Trans people are erasing women. Oh my god. Transphobic. Unhinged transphobes. Transphobic. Transphobic? Transphobes. Transphobic legislation. It's okay to be transphobic. Transphobic nonsense. Transphobic, literally transphobic. Transphobes, transphobic nonsense, average transphobe. Goodness, they're turning all of our kids transgender. Transphobic people, transphobic at all. Rabid transphobic nonsense, transphobic energy. Transphobic nonsense. Fundamentally, they're dangerous and they're ridiculous and like they're straight up evil.
Hey, what's going on, everyone? Welcome back to First Reaction TV. My name is J Mart. That was Benjamin Carollo, who is a transgender person who just recently had a falling out with the Young Turks media company. So obviously, just by listening to that introduction, we know why Benjamin Carollo thinks that there was a falling out. It was because of transphobia, obviously. But we're going to go a little more in-depth. We're going to get behind the reasons why this actually happened. Cenk, the owner of the Young Turks, actually did a reaction video to Benjamin Carollo's video, and we're going to cover both of them. It's very interesting. I hope you guys really enjoy this video. Please hit that like button, comment, subscribe. Let me know what you guys think of the video. I really appreciate you watching.
Alright, so in case it wasn't obvious from the title of this video, I'm done with TYT. This is mostly about Cenk and Anna. But of course, since like they're the people that are like the big names on the network and Cenk kind of like owns the company, it's a pretty big deal when they do something like, I don't know, become incredibly transphobic and start what appears to be a ridiculous right-wing grift. I mean, literally everything from the things that they said about homeless people to the stuff that they said about abolitionists and their general sort of like refusal to hear the people that are criticizing them and saying, no, this is what people are actually trying to say. You're not really hearing what we're saying, or you're not listening. We're mostly going to be focusing on their transphobia, which they have been escalating rapidly, which I guess is something that everybody really predicted would happen starting, I think about 6 months ago, 4 months ago, when Anna Kasparian put out a tweet complaining about the use of the term birthing person, which is really, really funny because she kept on talking about how, like, it erases women, and it minimizes womanhood down to just body parts. Except for it literally doesn't.
Alright, so right off the bat, Benny goes after Anna Kasparian, where a couple months ago, she tweeted out that she didn't want to be referred to as a birthing person, and that she thought that as a woman, she should be called a woman. Now, there were two different ways that people went at her for this. The easy way, transphobe. Anna Kasparian wasn't allowed to have an opinion on womanhood as a woman. She was just a transphobe being transphobic. Next was that people did this weird song and dance like it wasn't happening. That people weren't making these crazy claims. That people weren't calling women people who menstruate or birthing people or the people with the capacity for pregnancy. People weren't saying that kind of stuff at all. Anna's just being weird and transphobic.
Just a different topic. The largest labor union in the country, the National Education Association, had been proposing a resolution for future contracts to replace the word mother with birthing parent. What does the president think about proposals like that one?
So we're not the NEA, and I would refer you to their team about that particular specific.
I also noticed you changed a term in your budget work. You shifted in places from using the term mother to birthing people rather than mother. Can you help me get a good definition of birthing people?
Well, I'll check on the language there, but I think if we're talking about those who give birth, I think we're talking about, I don't know how else to explain it to you other than
Professor Bridges, you said several times, you've used a phrase, I want to make sure I understand what you mean by it. You've referred to people with a capacity for pregnancy. Would that be women?
Many women, cis women, have the capacity for pregnancy. Many cis women do not have the capacity for pregnancy. There are also trans men who are capable of pregnancy, as well as non-binary people who are capable of pregnancy. Black people with the capacity for pregnancy, person with the capacity for pregnancy has, and I'm talking about the person with the capacity for pregnancy.
You're not in.
I think that the person with the capacity for pregnancy.
So I brought a lawsuit on behalf of all the menstruating people in Michigan, 2.2 million.
Men do not menstruate. Only women menstruate. Now, you can call yourself
Cis men
whatever you
don't
want.
menstruate, but trans men do menstruate.
No.
The audacity and just the arrogance for cis women to believe that they own periods, that they own womanhood. You don't.
But would you at least admit calling a mom a birthing person could be offensive to some moms, that they don't want to get like a happy birthing person card in May? Or, I mean, can you at least admit that that term itself could be offensive to some moms?
Senator, I'll go back and take a look at the terminology that was used, and I can get back to you. But again, if we're trying to be precise in the language that's used.
Mom's a pretty good word.
All right, so I probably could have went on for another 2 hours and made a full-length feature film with people coming up with different terms for the word woman. But you can kind of see Anna Kasparian's point here, that this wasn't out of left field and that this wasn't some transphobic random comment. Like this is happening on a daily basis in the United States, and it's not just on like far left Twitter ideology spaces. These were people in power. This was the health secretary. This was the White House press secretary. This was the governor of Michigan. The one woman there was a professor at a university where she's teaching her students to talk like this. Like, this isn't just some crazy left-wing ideology only in some small spaces. Like, they are pushing this onto the greater population. And having a woman stand up and say, hey, I'd like to be called a woman because I'm a woman and not a birthing person, doesn't really seem like it should be that controversial. But in Benny's eyes, this is completely transphobic, and this is where all this mess started.
And that really is why so many people predicted that they were going to go into this extreme turf pipeline, because, of course, that's a very common starting point right there. The trans people are erasing women. Oh my god. But then everything escalated when they decided to talk about trans people in sports, which is a very common thing that a lot of cisgender people like to complain about because they don't understand how hormones work. And instead of attempting to try and get any type of understanding, they just want to sit and argue about their assumptions about how they think hormones should work. They come in with all of these assumptions about biological males and think that there's some sort of magic secret advantage that just exists persistently regardless as to what hormones are literally dictating what your body is doing at the time. And that's where I came in, and I started tweeting at some of the hosts saying that, hey, you're wrong about this, that, or the other thing. You're missing these details. Hey, you're literally just being transphobic right now. I even reached out to people within the network to say like, hey, I would like to maybe sit down with Cenk and maybe even have an on-the-air conversation where I could talk about how all of this stuff actually works. You know, I may not be a doctor, but I like to think that in my master's degree in biotechnology and my experience literally being a trans person, who, by the way, most trans people will do a ton of research about hormones before they get on them because a lot of doctors don't really know that much about it. So that's actually something that I did, where I spent a ton of time like reading through like research papers about what would be like the best for my transition and how it would go and things like that. So I'd like to think with my background, with some experience in biology, and, you know, reading a ton about how specifically hormone replacement therapy works for trans women like myself, I might know a thing or two about all of these things. And I figured, hey, if Cenk doesn't know about this, maybe it'd be interesting for him to learn. But with that though, he wasn't really interested in having an on-the-air conversation because, you know, he seemed pretty intent on not changing his mind, but he was open to having a phone conversation. So I handed to him on that, like, yeah, great. So we had a chat over the phone.
All right, so I have to stop it here quick and have to point out a couple things here. Just because someone may be transgender doesn't make you an expert in sports. If I own a car, it doesn't all of a sudden make me an expert in cars and make me a mechanic. If I own a house, I am not all of a sudden an expert construction worker. That's not how this works, and that's not how life works. Just because Benjamin is transgender, it has absolutely nothing to do with biology differences between men and women. It has nothing to do with transgenders playing against women in women's sports. So yes, Benjamin may have more experience actually and physically going through some sort of transition, even though he hasn't transitioned technically. I'm not really sure what that has to do with his opinion mattering more, or the science changing because he's transgender. Like, just because you yourself are a transgender person does not change the overall science and fact on the matter. And just one more quick point here. Most employers in this country would have had the don't let the door hit you in the ass on the way out type of mindset. And the fact that Benjamin got his own private phone call from probably the most successful news media company owner on YouTube in the past 20 years says a lot. Cenk went out of his way to make this phone call happen and to take care of his employee, and that says a lot. And the fact that he's getting crushed right now and being called all of these things by someone who actually was the beneficiary of something like this kind of blows my mind. And I also think it says a lot about Benjamin and his state of mind for trashing his employer and not noticing how good he may have had it.
The first sticking point was Cenk seemed convinced of this idea that I'm living in some sort of bubble. They've even said it on the air, that people fighting for trans rights are all living in some sort of bubble. The problem with that is I have a lot of random trans people from a ton of different political perspectives that will like reach out to me about like, hey, how are things going at TYT? Or hey, you're really inspiring. You know, stuff like that. And I also have like a decent circle of friends and family, many of which who are sort of all over the place politically. I told Cenk very specifically, you know I have friends that are like big Joe Biden fans, right? Like they're theoretically to your political right. His reaction to that was quite literally laughter.
Oh my God. Also, in your consumer news. I'm sorry.
Cenk seemed convinced of this idea that I'm living in some sort of bubble. I told Cenk very specifically, you know I have friends that are like big Joe Biden fans, right? Like,
so
I honestly do feel really bad for them.
Jeez, yes, I know.
Hey, I don't think that's a thing. That's not a thing. She's gonna fall one of these days.
The first sticking point was Cenk seemed convinced of this idea that I'm living in some sort of bubble.
I can look at this person and I can tell you with absolute certainty, this person only hangs out with one other type of person that is the carbon copy of all their social views.
Cenk very specifically, you know I have friends that are like big Joe Biden fans, right? Like they're theoretically to your political right.
What the fuck?
Just to kind of reiterate on things here, if you're on the left and you're a progressive, and your best idea of diversity is, you know, of someone that liked Joe Biden, dude, you're in trouble, okay? Like, bro, you're in trouble. That's the definition of a bubble, okay? If you don't even know someone that is an independent or that's a libertarian or even a Republican, God forbid if you knew a real Republican out there, like, that's a bubble, okay? That's the definition of a bubble. And Cenk's outside perspective sees that. And he's trying to give you some wisdom and some knowledge here that you're obviously refusing to take. And you're refusing to look at yourself and your life and do any sort of self-reflection in any sort of way. Because being a Democrat and your best example of not being in a bubble is pointing that someone likes a Democrat that you know. Like, bro, that's a bubble. That's a bubble.
And he just kind of wouldn't believe. He was like, no, you're in a bubble. You're in a bubble. And I kept pressing. I was like, no, Cenk, you don't understand. I matched with a random person on Tinder, and the first thing that they started talking to me about is how transphobic TYT has been lately. Because I think that they had just kind of figured out who I was. And Cenk was like, no, see, you're living in a bubble. And it's like, yeah, okay, buddy. That completely random person I matched with on Tinder is just part of the bubble that I'm magically living in.
You literally can't make this stuff up. An app that tracks you, that tracks your likes, that tracks your dislikes, that people match based off their points of view, based off their political points of view, based on their likes and dislikes, and you match with someone that matches you, and that you're going to use that person that you matched with on Tinder as your example of outside knowledge and not being in a bubble. Bro, once again, you got some problems here.
But really that kind of gave me the vibe of like, oh, Cenk really thinks that like every trans person is part of some sort of ideology, that we're of like a strict like political viewpoint, and that we don't just exist as like a type of person that exists, you know? It really did seem like Cenk was of the mind that to be transgender is to subscribe to a very specific political viewpoint, which, I don't know if you know this, but that's actually something that the, like, most unhinged transphobes are, like, spewing as conspiracy theories and stuff like that. They're like, these trans rights activists are all part of this strict ideological group, and they're infecting people with this radical gender ideology, is literally what, like, these unhinged right-wingers are saying. But it does kind of seem like Cenk is just kind of in that camp of like, oh, if you're trans, you must by definition be like some sort of radical leftist thing. Which honestly was just really, really frustrating to have in that conversation. Because the people that are in my circle of friends are people who like literally have been homeless in their lives and people who literally are making like ridiculous amounts of money. I have a pretty broad circle, you know. Something that kind of happens sometimes when you're like a polyamorous trans woman that's like a little bit popular on the internet.
My guess is going to be anybody that would be okay with a polyamorous trans person all probably come from a hyper-specific background. That is probably an incredibly specific background of people that that would be okay with that. Just a guess. I could be wrong.
But then there's the other part that was like even more disturbing, which was I pointed out something that Anna had said on the air, where I was like, hey, Anna said this bit about doctors giving hormone therapy to children because they were afraid of being called transphobic. And I was very clear. I was like, you know that's not happening, right? Like, you know that that isn't happening. And Cenk's response was, you know, I don't know. See, I could see it happening, though. And I'm like, no, but you couldn't. Because, you know, if that actually did happen, that would be medical malpractice, and it would be like a federal case to just give kids hormone replacement therapy because you didn't want to seem transphobic. That's ridiculous. On its face is ridiculous. Anybody who knows anything about politics would know that not only would that be a federal case, but it would be like national headlines. Every single newspaper would turn that into the biggest story for months. I mean, literally, the biggest story transphobes have had for the past 2 months is Dylan Mulvaney being on a can of Budweiser. So do you think that they really wouldn't make it national headlines even if it just happened once? But no, Cenk still doubled down and was like, I don't know, I could see that happening. And it's like, great, we have somebody who is like the head of a news network who is like basing political opinions off of things that he could see happening. Like, what a wonderful position to be in at this point. Like, the real brilliant five-head political take right there. You know, I could imagine this scenario, and that really says something about society, doesn't it? And that had to be one of the most unhinged parts of that phone call.
When we started seeing more females coming forward, and this has happened across the Western world.
And as a psychologist, did you ever feel that you could say to a parent, I don't believe your child is trans?
No, and this is one of the reasons why I decided to leave the service, because as a psychologist, I felt that if I ever spoke to a family like this, I would immediately be called transphobic.
All right, so to use Benny's words here, this absolute unhinged conversation that they're having, I think proves Cenk's point beyond reasonable doubt now. There are so many societal pressures out there, political pressures out there, and the fact that you couldn't understand a doctor not willing to share their point of view or to share their mind on something that's literally called gender affirming care, where you have to affirm this person's identity and you have to affirm their beliefs, is mind-blowing to me. It's called gender affirming care. It's not called doctors non-affirming. Like, if they gave their points of view and if they said, no, wait, I think you're just gay, you're damn right, their practice would be literally shut down. There'd be protesters outside their practice overnight. Like, you can't tell me that these doctors don't feel this pressure. It's recorded even. There's videos out there, there's articles out there. A lot of people are afraid to even go on the record and say this, but there are doctors, psychologists out there that have gone on the record and said, hey, I had this job and I literally felt like I was not allowed to give my professional point of view because I would be labeled something and it would damage my life. That's fact. And the fact that Benny doesn't know this, once again, it literally proves the bubble and the shell that he's in.
But whatever. I sent him some research papers about trans people in sports that went into detail pretty clearly about like, hey, there's no evidence that there's any reason to discriminate against trans people in sports. And that was like the conclusion that it came to pretty firmly, right? Hey, there's no evidence that we should discriminate against trans people.
False.
What a wild concept. It's amazing. I know. But Cenk apparently has learned the wrong lesson from that, especially when you look at some of the clips from his most recent rant about trans people that he just did the other day regarding trans people in sports and the extreme radical activists that support trans people in sports.
No, the hormone blockers do lower the testosterone, they do even things out a lot, right? But the men still have other physical advantages, like we maintain mass much better. And to give you a sense of how unfair this is, that where she won in Canada with 275-pound bench press. I bench press 275. Okay, and that's not a big deal for a guy.
This is so ridiculous. This is literally so ridiculous. Okay, think about this. He's like, oh, this trans woman won a competition where she broke a record bench pressing 275 pounds. And clearly, that's unfair. Because I, a cisgender man, can easily bench press 275 pounds. Therefore, there must be an advantage. And it's like, my guy, she literally broke a record. Like, what are you talking about? She clearly wasn't having like an incredibly easy time. You're stumbling so close to the point. Like, Cenk is literally incapable in this moment of separating trans women from cisgender men in his own brain right here.
So once again, this bubble concept is unfortunately going to be reoccurring for Benny. Cenk is simply saying, look, men on average can lift more, period, okay? So when a man just says that he's a woman and transfers and competes in the women's division, that woman can now just naturally lift more than the average woman can.
Like, oh, you're betraying the trans community by fighting for trans rights. How dare you just say that trans people should be treated equally in society? Don't you know that you're supposed to live as second-class citizens so that I can feel better about myself when I give you rights? Literally, spare me. This is ridiculous. But I think the real icing on the cake here is this tweet where Anna Kasparian has decided to unilaterally declare Jesse Singal to not be a transphobe, despite, and this is what's really wild, Jesse Singal literally talking to whistleblowers at a medical facility that appear to have made some significant HIPAA violations about their patients in sharing the information that they did with Jesse Singal. And, of course, you have him running around spewing all of the same transphobic nonsense that basically your average transphobe is gonna be spreading. You know, the types of things about like, oh, we don't know about hormones, and oh, HRT for kids, and oh my god, it's so terrifying. Oh my goodness, they're turning all of our kids transgender. Oh my god.
Singal is a good faith, I think, critical thinker. I'm subscribed to Blocked and Reported. I have listened to endless podcast episodes from Blocked and Reported. I haven't seen anything from Jesse Singal that communicates to me that he is a transphobe, that he is a bad person. He did straight news reporting on basically what, you know, some of the risks could be when it comes to transitioning literal kids with puberty blockers and then cross-sex hormones. And through his reporting, which I'm very sad to say I didn't really come across until this year, I learned that I was wrong about a bunch of other things.
Like, Jesse Singal literally is one of the, like, more notable transphobic people that is out there putting out misinformation about trans people.
It's really convenient that Benny decided to stop the clip there of Anna, because Anna goes on to say that she discovered that puberty blockers weren't reversible, and that a lot of these medications that the kids were getting at an early age could not be turned back, and that the changes that were happening to their body were permanent. And that's what changed Anna's mind moving forward on some of these things. Now, once again, that doesn't make someone transphobic. That makes someone reading the science and doing the studies and having a change of opinion, which is the way we as a society should function. But what you have is someone here going, read science, read biology, read this. But throughout this 30-minute rant that Benny does, he doesn't cite anything. He doesn't bring up any science. He makes a bunch of squeals and whines and screams and does all these crazy voices, but he hasn't provided one piece of evidence stating, hey, I'm right because this is why I'm right. Here's a scientific study. He says, I read studies and I know science and I read biology, but he hasn't really provided anything to prove any of his points of view at all.
What it boils down to is hormone replacement therapy is literally just puberty. Like, at the end of the day, it's just puberty. And yeah, whether it's puberty with estrogen or testosterone, it's going to carry some risks just like it does with cisgender children. That's just part of puberty. And it's actually not all that different if it's a trans puberty or a cis puberty, believe it or not. And so anybody fear-mongering about the effects are permanent, yeah, that's kind of the whole point, isn't it? You know? Isn't that like the whole point? But if the effects were really entirely permanent, then transitioning as an adult wouldn't really work, would it? And yet, of course, it does.
Alright, so you want to talk about Unhinged. This is where things get a little unhinged. And you can tell Benny's just going into like scatterbrain mode now. Puberty for a normal child compared to putting puberty blockers or hormone replacement on a child is not nearly or remotely close to being the same thing. Whenever a normal person goes through puberty, their reproductive organs and all of their abilities are still in place. That's a normal puberty. Whenever a transgender kid is going through puberty and you make them take a bunch of chemicals that literally take away their reproductive rights, is not the same thing as a normal puberty. Like, I'm sorry, dude, but I don't know what reality you're in.
And so, really, when you take all this together, it seems like Anna Kasparian is fully engulfed into, like, the conspiracy theories against trans people. And I genuinely think that she believes a lot more than what she's saying. Because I've just seen hints of, like, just some, like, extremely rabid transphobic nonsense. And with Cenk seems to be following Anna Kasparian along and kind of seems to be of the vibe of like, oh, no, I'm this big smart news guy and I've been doing this for a long time. I couldn't possibly be wrong, and very much relying on his lack of any type of understanding of biology and just making ridiculous assumptions about the difference between men and women and thinking that that's some sort of like universally applicable thing, not thinking about how hormones play a role in that, and of course is bouncing off of Anna's deeply transphobic energy. And of course, he can't help himself but frame himself as like the brilliant galaxy brain reasonable person. And of course, all these trans people are just ridiculous and out there and just radical. And couldn't possibly be, you know, referencing like very basic science that is easy to go through. And any attempts to educate either Anna Kasparian or Cenk has kind of just been met with a lot of stubbornness, of digging in their heels, rejecting the new information, and replacing it with their own imaginations about how they think things should be. And it just continues to escalate over the past several months. And that fundamentally is why I just can't be a part of TYT anymore. It's just too much. It's ridiculous. Because at a certain point it becomes embarrassing for me.
Alright, so there you have it. Benny's out. He's done. Now, the funny fact about this is that Benny quit here because of pressure and because he was embarrassed and didn't want to belong to this organization that is now perceived transphobic according to some of these radical leftists. But he couldn't understand the fact that doctors could be pressured into giving gender-affirming care when they may not think it's necessary. So something as serious and as heavy as someone losing their practice or the weight and the backlash of the community coming down on doctors or a doctor's office, he couldn't understand that, but he's out. It's embarrassing for him. It's too much pressure. Can't take it. So once again, even though I don't agree with pretty much anything the Young Turks organization stands for as far as what their political identity is, I give Cenk a ton of props for doing this. And you have to give it to him, man. Like, way not to bow into the pressure. And now, saying that, let's hear Cenk's response.
You guys know that recently someone who we liked and really supported, etc., decided to call me an evil person, a racist, a transphobe, pathetic, embarrassing, all these terrible, terrible, terrible things. And then they quit. And after they quit, they say, I quit because this guy who runs the company won't agree with me. But sister, I platformed you. I said, here's a platform, go for it. And not only can you say anything you want, you can say something that totally and utterly disagrees with me. Not good enough. Is that a standard? That everyone has to agree with just one of the hosts? Well, if that's the standard and two hosts disagree, what am I gonna do? Well, I'm for, apparently the new standard is everyone must agree. So who do I fire? Which of the two hosts that disagree do I fire? Do I go to Twitter and ask the left-wing activists or the ones pretending to be activists for our side? Okay, guys, since apparently no one voted, but apparently you guys are the arbiters of what's on the left, despite the fact that the polling shows that you are not. You're often very, very, very wrong. Yeah, I'll give you the classic example, Latinx. I was told 100 times, oh, you are being against, you're going against the Latino community. It's like, I don't think so. I've never seen a Latino person call themselves Latinx. I think you made that up. They're like, how dare you, right? And it turns out we did a poll, or we didn't do it, somebody did. 96% of Latinos don't want to be called Latinx. Did anyone learn from that? That maybe randos online don't actually know what they're talking about and that they don't actually speak for that community? But even if they did or we were wrong, etc., the most important thing is, will we have disagreement and will that be allowed? And the answer definitively on the Young Turks is yes. And if you don't like that, like I said, there's a billion options, right wing, left wing, and they'll tell you whatever you want to hear. There should be no discussion. There is a correct opinion, and everyone should be forced to have that correct opinion. Or they should be canceled or fired, or no one should watch them, or all these other consequences that flow from that. Well, God bless, there's really good news because there's tons of leftist shows now that never disagree with a preset so-called leftist ideology. They agree with 100% of the issues, 100% of the time, and they almost all do it, right? You sure they're honest with you that they agree with the whatever is the trend of the day 100% of the time?
So yeah, once again, I just have to give Cenk props here because I feel like more often than not in leftist media, people aren't allowed to disagree. You have plenty of disagreements in the centrist/right area where there's libertarians and conservatives and hardcore Republicans and this, but it seems like on the left side of things, on MSNBC or CNN, where if you go on there and you have some sort of dissenting point of view, you get labeled a transphobe, a racist, a this, that, like right off the bat, that you have to agree with, like Cenk said, 10 out of 10 things. And if you only agree on 9 out of 10 things, then you're a right-wing fascist conspiracy theorist. It's crazyville, man. And I have to applaud Cenk for standing up to, whatever he believes in, to say, look, in this political space, we need disagreement. We have to have disagreement. We have to have different points of view, and we have to talk to each other. Like, that has to happen. And if the end of that conversation doesn't result in us agreeing, then that's okay. Like, it's all right. And the fact that this whole video revolved around an employee crying because his employer didn't agree with everything he said shows the state of the country, and I think is a validation of what everybody's worrying about right now. And when people will say, that's woke, this is woke, those people over there are woke, this is woke. Like, this is wokeness in play. A 20-something-year-old employee saying, my grown adult employer who built a business up from scratch has to agree with me, or I'm going to call him a transphobe on Twitter. Like, that's wokeness. Like, that's the kind of culture war sphere that we live in right now, and good for Cenk for not giving into it. So I really hope you guys enjoyed this video. Please take a second and hit that like button. Subscribe. We're almost to 3,000 subscribers, so I really appreciate the support. Let me know what you guys think in the comments, and thanks for watching.
I matched with a random person on Tinder, and the first thing that they started talking to me about is how transphobic TYT has been lately.
What? No. Oh, come on. No fucking shot. What? This is like the most that happened story I've ever heard in my entire life.